Hello, and welcome to another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. My name is Andrej Matišak, and I work as the Deputy Head of Foreign Desk in Slovak Daily Pravda, which, by the way, means truth, and it's not Russian Pravda. How has the nature of threats changed over the past decades? With a 36-year career in Canada's foreign service and security community, Jennifer Irish can tell. We met at the Stratcom Under Pressure conference in Bratislava, organized by the Hoaxy and Podvody Hoaxes and Scams project. Ms. Irish is the founding director of the Information Integrity Lab at the University of Ottawa, and we discuss foreign interference in elections, whether Russia is the most malign actor in the global information sphere, what US President Donald Trump means for Canada, and whether a disinformation campaign could lead to a kinetic war. Listen to our conversation. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Coffee. For the link, see also a description of this episode. And now, up to the new debate. Ms. Irish, in Canada's security and intelligence community, you led intelligence assessment and analysis of global threats and trends, including as Director General at the Integrated Terrorism Assessment Center. Considering over 3 decades of your experience, can you briefly tell us what security risks kept you awake at night 20 years ago? And what about now? Are they somewhat similar or fundamentally different?
I should just, first of all, qualify that I'm not here as part of the Canadian government, and my experience in foreign affairs and also in Canada's security intelligence community is over. So I'm sort of speaking retrospectively on this question. But I would say certainly in my last tour in foreign affairs, when I was the Deputy Director of International Crime and Terrorism, and this was in the early 2000s, our main preoccupation was understanding terrorism. So because we understood organized crime quite well, like we got used to, the trafficking patterns, how to disable them, looking at cartels. And when we tried to apply that same expertise to terrorism worked in networks, sometimes networks that didn't know one node or the other, and where the head of the network wasn't necessarily key. Like if you took off the head of a cartel, sometimes a cartel would dissipate, but that's not the case in terrorism. Also to understand the ideologically motivations behind terrorism, who these groups were, where they came from, the degree of threat that existed within our domestic society. So that idea of kind of like a borderless group where all of a sudden you have non-state actors as key kind of nefarious, hostile actors, when your whole experience up to that point had either been on the defense side or organized crime side. So that was certainly something that I recall from that early period. I think now geopolitically, we're back into the world of great power relations. So, to understand again the competition that exists between the great powers, particularly US and China, in part that's driven by different kind of world visions. Technology comes into there. Russia, which one had thought was a declining power, has resurged using different methods. But alongside, terrorism hasn't disappeared. The importance of defense hasn't disappeared. Organized crime hasn't disappeared. So I think I see just a layering of threat upon threat. And so when it comes to states who are looking at, how do we understand the threat environment and how do we respond to the threat environment, it's now multi-layered. And then when you throw on top of that technology, and this particular conference that we're at today in Bratislava is all about disinformation and foreign influence. Well, all of a sudden, bots, trolls, and algorithms have a role. They are threat actors when they are manipulated by hostile actors, whether those be state actors or non-state actors. And so it gives a whole different dimension. And alongside that, you see a huge change in the nature of conflict. So everyone's talking about hybrid war now. So we see cyber attacks, drones, information warfare, and sabotage, espionage, all coming to play. Some of this is just below the level of kind of what we call gray zone conflict, right? But some of it has kinetic dimension, and so that puts it into the category of Yeah, I was looking at, kind of active hybrid warfare, and we're almost in that situation, especially in some parts of Europe, I would say, that are particularly close to Russia. When I look at what's happening in the Baltics and the Nordic countries, they are already experiencing kinetic events, such as the severing of sea cables and such. So warfare has become a lot more complicated when you add in on top information warfare, even more so. So I guess the way I would sum that is just that we have now threat layered upon threat, and we need to have a very complicated, mitigation playbook or response playbook to deal with the complexity of how all these threats and trends fit together.
So is the world a more dangerous place now than it was, I don't know, even after 9/11?
Well, I would say there's some similarities there, because after 9/11, because we didn't understand terrorism, and now there are things that we don't understand in our geopolitical environment as well, it's at least comparable. It's hard to kind of weigh them against each other, except for, I would say, we are living in an extremely dangerous time.
Do you consider the US a threat to Canada? American President Donald Trump likes to talk about the annexation of your country and was willing to impose tariffs on Canada just because of the ad he doesn't like.
We're definitely in a trade war with the United States, because now there's tit for tat in the tariff side. Underneath that, we are still trying to negotiate or have discussions with the US to try to resolve those trade differences, combined with possible security discussions alongside, given, some of the concerns that the US has expressed. But that kind of papers over, I think, what we're seeing. I think most Canadians like myself who have, kind of worked shoulder to shoulder with the US for so long, kind of feel that there's a major trust deficit now in the relationship. There's an unpredictability in the relationship. There's an uncertainty in the relationship. And so all of that is extremely disruptive.
The title of your conference panel was Foreign Interference in Elections. Can you give me an example of an election in a democratic country that you think was clearly affected by foreign interference? Or at least, can we talk a little bit about how it works?
I'm here at this conference to talk about Canada's experience with foreign interference in elections. And I did talk about that there have been foreign interference in Canada's election, and there was a public inquiry that examined that foreign interference. And it was concluded, while that foreign interference existed, it did not have a decisive influence in the outcome of the elections. I'm uncomfortable making judgments on other people's elections, but I can say, the kind of tactics that are particularly damaging in electoral processes are narratives that try to draw into question the integrity of elections. So we faced that in our most recent election, 2025, allegations that ballots were mishandled or that there was a lack of legitimacy. And you see these narratives across elections. It's for those who are intent on undermining democratic processes, it's a common narrative to draw into question something to do with the democratic process, whether it's about machines or it's about pencils and being able to change the results or how ballots are handled. And that can be disruptive to public trust. And that's a lot of what these tactics are aimed against. Is sometimes it's aimed against trying to get a particular electoral outcome, but often we're seeing the tactics are really aimed at just eroding public trust over time. And what we're seeing in Canada is that we've experienced foreign interference in our elections, but we're also seeing ongoing, pervasive, and persistent attempts to sow discord in our democratic discourse. And I think that's just as important as a focus on democratic processes. So yes, democratic processes are important. We need to develop integrity around those to make sure we're protecting the vote. On an ongoing basis, we should be as equally as concerned about attempt to sow discord or issues within our ability to have democratic discourse within our democracies, because ultimately democracy depends upon that as much as it does on the actual casting of a ballot.
But how to keep the people's trust, or even maybe I would say to win this trust back? Because in almost every elections, there is some at least a bit of foreign interference. And on the other hand, there are also all the time, and I think that was the same in your country, the internal actors that are in fact gaining from people not trusting the processes, not trusting the election, not trusting the election's outcome. So I know there are no magic formulas, but just from your experience, what's the best way to address people worries, concerns?
That's a profoundly difficult question. It's one facing most of our democracies now, especially I think we regard kind of COVID-19 as kind of being a watershed where, public trust was particularly disruptive. And I don't think it's ever kind of recuperated. And part of the challenge we face, even from labs like the one I headed, was you want to make sure the public is aware of the information threat, but you also don't want the public to become so distrustful of information that they don't know what to believe. And so how do you find that happy medium is a real challenge. And I think there's kind of two issues. In the public world, it's about public trust, and in the commercial world, it's also about reputation. And both are being undermined by disinformation. I think my advice to governments, because this is really a governmental issue, is to make sure that your public understands why you exist, how you help them, and what is the purpose of your different programs, to make sure that people understand what is it that you're trying to accomplish. And if you're trying to propel a new program or policy, that people understand what's in it for them, how they benefit, that basic civics education can go a long way, making sure people understand the narrative behind your country, the values that you're trying to represent, and also that your citizens are given the tools for them to critically understand information before them so that they can decide for themselves what's best for them, because that's ultimately what democracy depends upon.
In your panel discussion, you mentioned the Russian operation targeting Canadian soldiers serving alongside the Slovak soldiers in Latvia. Can you tell us more about what happened?
Well, this was just one of the narratives that the multinational brigade faced during the first deployment under Operation Reassurance. And this particular narrative was suggesting that the presence of Canadian troops put pressure on housing stock in Latvia and housing prices in Latvia. This is where it's important to make sure we understand the distinction between disinformation and misinformation. Because sometimes there's a kernel of truth in this, as there was in this case. So part of the challenge when you're responding to these kinds of narratives is to clear the record, so to make sure that the fact basis is understood and dispelled. But this was disinformation. The motive providing that narrative was not because, in this case, Russia had an interest about housing prices in Latvia. Their interest was to try to sow discord between the presence of troops and the local Latvian population. It's an example I use to just show that when you're responding to narratives, it's not enough just to respond to the fact basis, but to go to the underlying intention as well.
So broadly speaking, is Russia the most malign actor in the global information sphere?
I would say, just in terms of the investments it's made and the pervasiveness of its networks, I would say, yes, it's number one or number two. The other one would be China, and they have different skill sets, I guess. China is certainly making a lot of gains, especially in AI and AI-generated products. And it's becoming extremely difficult to detect generated AI, visual and multimodal disinformation. But what makes Russia a threat to be taken seriously is it has a decentralized network of trolls and bots and influencers that's very pervasive. In fact, it's possible that there are those who exist within the Russian ecosystem who may not even be conscious that they exist within the Russian ecosystem because it's so decentralized, because it's so pervasive, and it's extremely well funded by the Russian government. So they seem to think that this is definitely effective as an instrument of their arsenal, so to speak, in terms of how information warfare fits into their broader strategy.
So talking about this, you've been here for a few hours, basically, but also you have heard quite a lot at the conference. So when you hear that the Russian narratives are quite widespread, that even leading politicians are repeating those narratives, would you think that from what you have heard during your stay here, that Slovakia might have a problem in the information space? And do you see there is an opening for the foreign interference?
Well, what I would say is I've been listening carefully at this conference, and I've heard some Slovakians express concern about their information ecosystem and about the perception of foreign interference. I am a foreigner in this country here to talk about Canada's experience, so it's not appropriate for me to provide a judgment on that. I would say, as a general observation, is one thing that's been helpful in the Canadian context as we have developed strategies for dealing with foreign interference in our electoral processes, but also in our democratic discourse, has been that the government has taken it very seriously, that the first stage in resolving any perceived problem is recognizing that you have a problem. And so that should come both from, a government, and it also needs to be recognized by the public so that they are aware of the existence of a threat. And they are also given the capacity and tool and training for making their own decisions within what can be a very complicated information environment.
So in Slovakia, as I said, that we have a fair share of leading politicians who are spreading Russian propaganda. I mentioned President Trump, who has no problem attacking people whom he disagree with. What should or what can be done when democratically elected politicians are clearly spreading fake news, misinformation, or even disinformation? Is there anything where we can just wait for another elections and hoping that voters will decide, okay, we don't like this, we don't like that?
Well, I think that's up for Slovakians to decide how to deal with those issues and the challenges that they face. And that's the ultimate in a democracy, is that Slovakians have to decide for themselves. It's not going to be outside actors who will rule or should interfere in that process. But it seems from the experience here that you have an active civil society and other partners who are taking that seriously. And as I said, if it's a Slovakian issue, it's got to be made in Slovakian solution.
We often hear that Russia is especially trying to flood the information space that is not promoting anything specific, but rather tries to create uncertainty and chaos to make people dismiss everything, even facts, even truth. So do you agree with this assessment, or do you think the reality is a bit more complicated?
I think, again, I can only speak for the Canadian experience, but what we're seeing in Canada from Russian influence operations is that they are trying to sow discord within our democratic discourse. So they're looking at, extremely sensitive issues around which there are robust discussions in Canada, because we have a healthy democracy, and then trying to find wedges or divisions within that. So those can be sensitive issues around, Israel. We've seen Israel-Gaza war, immigration, gender identification as all being issues around which Russia tries to provide wedges. But I also think there is an influence dimension to Russian disinformation, particularly around the Russia-Ukraine war. So certainly in Canada, we've faced attempts to sow discord in the transatlantic collaboration, for example, or NATO in particular, or perceptions in the Canada-US relationship have all been kind of weaponized by Russia in the information space in order to try to chip away at alliances. And that's the influence dimension behind that. If that's seen as an asset for them, in terms of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, their invasion of Ukraine, their aspirations more broadly, that a weakened alliance is obviously in its interest. And so I see that part of its agenda being played out in Canada as well.
I usually hear from people who are somehow supportive of Russia or trying to defend Russia when talk about how Russia is trying to influence elections of other countries, that the West is doing the same, that we are supporting some democratic movement somewhere, or we are supporting mobilization of voters, or we are supporting that young voters, the mobilization of young voters, and the programs really exist like that. So do you think this is the same, or this is very different?
I think it's very different in part because, we built into the definition of disinformation the idea of motive. right? So I think the motives behind, a country who's intent on undermining someone's country or democracy are different from a country who's trying to promote the value of democracy. I would just draw a distinction between democratic processes, which, should not be interfered with by other countries. But I myself come from a country that does actively promote democratic values and the importance of democratic participation. And I personally believe that democracies need to come together more, that if we share more information about the narratives that we face in the information space and their motives, and also the tactics, techniques, and procedures that are used by actors who are trying to undermine our societies, then we can do more as democracies together. I'm personally a supporter of efforts to support the value of democracy in different societies, and even more than that, active collaboration between democracies to add, resiliency to them, because I fear that democracy is under threat. And when you ask me my first question about what I fear now, that's one of my personal top fears, is the threat that democracy faces.
Can you imagine that disinformation campaign in the North Atlantic Alliance can lead to activating NATO Article 5 and to the kinetic war?
I'm not an expert on NATO Article 5, but I can't see an example where on its own it would. I think there would have to be a kinetic element, but I would preface that by saying I'm not an expert in that area. But I am convinced that the next generalized conflict will be a hybrid conflict that will involve a combination of measures, including information, cyber, and so forth. I mean, ultimately, I guess to take control of another state, there has to be a physical presence of some sort. But again, I wouldn't want to opine on the degree to which Article 5 applies. I think we're in a complex time about trying to define those gray lines, and it's definitely not easy. But definitely the next conflict will be a combination of information with other forms of conflict, especially the kinetic.
And one last thing, and I'm not going to ask you being positive as you've been asked at the panel, because myself, I'm not very positive about it. Full disclosure, I really think that to save democracy, we should switch off the internet, because the AI is coming. I don't think we have a clue what it will bring. I know my idea is extremely radical. You will probably disagree with it, but still, don't you think that we are just tilting at windmills with all of this? And, we are successful here, successful there, but because of for the lack of the words, the other side can do anything what they want, and they have no moral constraints, no ethical constraints, and so on. They will be still at least one step ahead of us. So do we need some more radical solutions, or we should focus on what we are doing, trying to debunk things, trying to talk to the people and stuff like this?
Yeah, I think that's a complex question, because we still need to act like democracies. Yeah. So they're already taking advantage of our democracy to sow discord, and then taking advantage of our democratic identities or our values to take license. I think my answer is that we actually have been pretty successful in understanding the disinformation space, like the narratives. We've invested a lot in terms of monitoring and detection. We all have cool tools for looking at, pattern recognition, looking at inauthentic behavior. And so we become really good at admiring the problem. And I think we need to invest more in the mitigation playbooks that we need to put together, both in, as different states, but also together possibly in broader coalitions to counter this, and understanding when these different tools are appropriate, like when you do a counter narrative or debunk, or when you engage in defensive cyber operations. And, there's a whole toolbox that we can rely upon. We shouldn't give up on trying to get collaboration with the tech platforms, even though at the moment it doesn't look very hopeful. But alongside, we also need to do more in terms of, from what we understand on the tactics, techniques, and procedures used by these actors, is be a little bit more disruptive. And we can. I think we've shown, we've seen in cybersecurity, right? So if we apply some of the lessons we have from cybersecurity to information warfare, there are some things that we can go after. Like one is, what are the personas that are being used? understanding, the trolls and bots and trying to go after them to try to do intercepts. Most importantly, all of these activities are funded. So going after the financing, going after the money laundering, making use of sanctions. We have used sanctions, for example, and going after RT. So we should put that in our toolbox as well. We can't be complacent. I mean, I'm not also advocating that we do things that are contrary to, democratic values, or that we cross a line and be something that we're not or shouldn't be, to be consistent with those values. But there's a lot that we can do, and we can learn from other domains, again, particularly in the cybersecurity area, where we can develop both the mitigation playbooks that we need to have to go after this, a smarter use of StratCom techniques. First of all, having a common language to understand the threat and a common approach to what kinds of approaches are especially disruptive given the types of techniques and tactics that we see. And there are some common languages like that that are being developed. And the more we can all adopt a common kind of threat approach or way of understanding that, the better off we'll be when we try to work collectively. And I do, again, reiterate that I think there is scope for collective action in this field.
This was another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. Subscribe, listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and on the other platforms. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Ko-fi. For the link, see also a description of this episode. Thank you for listening and stay tuned.